The concept of FlightBridgeED was sparked when a growing need and a dream united into an idea. That idea grew into a passion, and from passion came a global community of providers and students joining in the revolution of pre-hospital, critical care, and emergency medicine education. Now, from around the world, we are calling our community together. We are proud to announce the FlightBridgeED Air and Surface Transport Symposium in Nashville, Tennessee on March 20th and 21st, 2018. World-class speakers, vendors, and of course, the FlightBridgeED team will be there. Go to our website now to register. Join the revolution. The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Today we're going to do a podcast on Acidosis Rodeo Part 3. I think it's fitting. We've been traveling a lot, doing lots of review classes, traveling pretty much every week. So I want to thank everybody for that. And we talk about this and these concepts constantly. This is a big, big deal. And, I think it's important to be able to identify metabolic acidosis. And so this podcast is going to focus more on kind of those obscure findings, just not the normal stuff. A few of these things are fairly normal, but what are some other causes of metabolic acidosis? In the review class, we go through kind of a systematic approach of looking at, why is a base excess -20, for example? We look at the sodium and chloride, we look at that SID level, the difference between there. We understand that sodium and chloride are strong acids. We look at albumin and how that affects, increase or decrease of your base excess. We look at lactate, we look at your ketones, and then we get into those osmolar gaps or those causes of toxic alcohols. And so that's where, if you don't have a, definitive, easy, identifiable reason, that's where you have to go through and really kind of be a detective. And so we're going to use an acronym that's, kind of a new way of approaching this, and it's called G.O.L.D.M.A.R.K. And G.O.L.D.M.A.R.K. replaced the old acronym of cat mud piles. Cat mud piles had a lot of aspects to it that were kind of a really rare formaldehyde, toxicity, iron toxicity, things that we didn't see or we don't see that often, or it's very, very rare. So G.O.L.D.M.A.R.K. is much better. And so we're going to kind of briefly go through here. We're not going to spend tons and tons of time, but I just kind of want to be able to illustrate some of these concepts and some of these things so we have a better understanding and we can, be better providers, make better decisions. I want to thank everybody again for coming to the review classes and just allowing us to invest in you. And I think for those of you kind of listening, maybe you're debating on it, do I need to go to a review class? Do I want to spend the money to do that? I think one of the things that separates us and hopefully why we're so busy, I'm very thankful that we are busy, that you as an industry, all of you out there are trusting in us, and I really take that seriously. Is I really feel like we invest in every single student. We don't want you to just come in and have us tell you how to pass the exam. That's not what we're about. If that's what you're looking for, that's not what we're about. We are about investing in you, investing in your ability to critically think, ability to understand medicine at a high level. And we want you to walk out of there rejuvenated, excited to learn, and kind of being that infectious person in your organization. You're going to get the test-taking aspects. We employ the test-taking tips throughout the entire course, but that is not our primary focus. And then you get that test-taking 101 once you leave the course as well. That continues with our online exams and things like that. So, we really, really focus on you becoming better at understanding the medicine. And I truly believe that if that happens, that you're going to be able to understand the questions, understand the physiology, and be able to take those tests. And I think our numbers, and the amount of people that pass first attempt is, a reflection of that. And, I'll give you my phone number. You can text me, you can call me, and I'll help you through the entire process. So I think that is one of those things that I love, is I seeing the light bulb come on and seeing people excited about learning and about learning new concepts. So check it out. We've got tons of courses. We're scheduled out till September of 2018 right now. And so, if you have any questions, feel free to call me or email, and we will answer those questions for you. So let's get started. G.O.L.D.M.A.R.K, we're going to kind of go through the acronym, so I'm just going to start with the first one, and G stands for glycols. And glycols are things like ethylene glycol and propylene glycol. And glycols are kind of a potent thing. We know that ethylene glycol is that antifreeze. And, it used to be that antifreeze was very sweet. They've changed that now to where that there's not that sweet taste to it. But we know that these are going to be that's going to be more of an ingestion. So this could be a pediatric ingestion, or it simply could be somebody trying to commit suicide. So I'm not going to focus a lot on ethylene glycol, but I want to focus on propylene glycol, and we're going to hit propylene glycol pretty extensively. And propylene glycol kind of has two aspects to it. And propylene glycol, primarily where we're going to see this, is medication toxicity. So this could be either overdose, or this could be administration by you or I. So these are medications like Dilantin, like phenobarbital. You have high concentrations of propylene glycol in those medications. And so if these doses get really, really large, these are pretty big doses, then you have a 40 to 60% ratio of propylene glycol to that medication based on the dosage. So the other medications that we have to watch out for are medications that we see in the ICU, or we use for long-standing sedation. So Ativan, Valium, those medications, you're giving these medications long-term to these ICU patients that are ventilator dependent. And we know that there's a big push right now to kind of watch that, look at delirium, and maybe use less or do sedation vacations, maybe use less benzodiazepines and use more ketamine, more fentanyl drips. But patients that are on long-standing sedation protocols, they can actually end up having a propylene glycol toxicity. That's going to lead to a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. So we have to really watch that. What about nitro? What about etomidate? Right? These are common medications that we give. These cause propylene glycol toxicity. Now, again, these are going to be high doses. We're talking like etomidate. You're talking 300 or 400 milligrams. But people could potentially overdose on these. They could get a hold of these things. So just want to kind of have you be aware of that. The way it works is propylene glycol actually metabolizes into lactic acid, and then it gets broken down eventually into carbon dioxide. And we know carbon dioxide is what's called a frank acid. We start building CO2, and we start having a pH that drops. So that's how it causes that severe metabolic acidosis. The next acronym, or part of the acronym, is going to be oxyproline. And oxyproline is a metabolite of Tylenol. So we see patients with this type of toxicity that are chronic Tylenol users. Most often these patients are going to be older, advanced age. They're going to be patients that are malnourished. They may be patients that are chronic alcohol users or chronic alcoholics. And they're going to be patients that have more of a chronic illness. So these patients can become toxic, and again, that is called oxyproline, a byproduct of acetaminophen. The next is going to be lactate, and that's L-lactate. So the L stands for L-lactate, and L-lactate is a byproduct of, we know, glycolysis. Whether you are talking about aerobic glycolysis or anaerobic glycolysis, lactate is a byproduct of both of those breakdowns, and that's essentially what's called oxidative phosphorylation. And so we know oxidative phosphorylation is how we produce ATP. We know that just the breakdown of pyruvate, whether you're talking about aerobic or anaerobic glycolysis, forms lactate. And we have to have lactate. I think that's a misconception that lactate's always bad. Lactate is not bad. Lactate is an indication of basically stress, and so that's why we use that in sepsis and in severe illness, ARDS, patients like that. We look at lactate. But lactate is a byproduct of breaking down sugar, essentially. So obviously, if you become anaerobic, If you want to listen to the podcast we just did on oxygen extraction, and we said that once you get to that 40%, we kind of use the relationship of we have so much income and we have so much debt. Well, once we have a debt-to-income ratio based on oxygen delivery versus consumption of 40%, we start moving in from an aerobic state to an anaerobic state. Well, just based on that anaerobic state, you have a switch of aerobic glycolysis to anaerobic glycolysis. And because we exclude the electron transport chain in that process, we basically go from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle. And then we go right back over to glycolysis. And so we're producing lots and lots of lactate. So you start building lactate, and we become kind of toxic. We have a lactic acidosis. So in that context, right, the treatment is going to be fix the anaerobic state. Try to bring the consumption side down. Reduce your debt. Remember, just think of it, debt-to-income ratio. Reduce that debt, increase your overall income. And that's exactly how we have to think of our patients. And then that lactate, hopefully based on a reduction of stress, you're going to have a reduction in lactate, and that's called lactate clearance. There's a second form of lactate, and that's where you get into D of G.O.L.D., and so that's called D-lactate. And D-lactate is a byproduct of acetaminophen use. It's seen in acetaminophen toxicity as well. It's seen in short bowel syndrome. So short bowel syndrome is a phenomenon based on, you have these severely obese patients that go in and have a bowel kind of reduction. And they're not doing those surgeries anymore. They're kind of handling it a little different, but they can definitely become toxic from what's called D-lactate that would normally metabolize, and it's a very small volume in normal patients. So that's an indication, again, of that short bowel syndrome. That's the most common finding. So we're going to get into, we did G.O.L.D. Now let's get into the M.A.R.K side. M stands for methanol. And so methanol is, again, going to be based on probably an ingestion. So this could be a pediatric. This could be an adult. So if somebody drank windshield wiper fluid, somebody drank paint removers, different paint removers, shoe dyes, you ingest shoe dyes. And so how do we treat this? What is toxic? What is considered toxic? Well, a toxic dose is going to be anything greater than 20 milligrams per deciliter. And remember, a deciliter is 100 mils or 100 milliliters. So that would be 20 milligrams in 100 mils. The primary medication used as an antidote for methanol toxicity is a medication called fomepizole. And fomepizole is dosed a specific way. I'm not going to get into the dosing. This is obviously going to be a dose ordered by a physician. We're not going to probably do this in the field. We don't carry this medication. But another medication used commonly is folic acid. And so only given if that methanol level is greater than 20 milligrams per deciliter, as I said. If those medications don't work, if it's not turning the patient around, then what they'll do is they'll put these patients on renal dialysis to try to get rid of and clear that medication or clear the methanol from the system. Let's move to A, and A is the big one. A is aspirin overdose or aspirin toxicity. And we know aspirin toxicity has to be a pretty massive dose. I mean, we're talking serious presentations are going to be 300 to 500 milligrams per kilo. And then fatal doses or lethal doses are going to be greater than 500 milligrams per kilo. So we know these patients present initially with a respiratory alkalosis. They then present to metabolic acidosis. And that hyperventilation we see in that initial response is based on the aspirin's stimulation of our respiratory centers. And so that's why we become, tachypnic. Our respiratory rate increases significantly, and that's why you initially see that alkalosis. Once we start having that alkalosis, your body is going to have an alkalytic urine based on that, right? That's one of the compensations of how we initially present. But this eventually leads to a metabolic acidosis, and what we have is we have a loss of potassium. We have a renal kind of issue. We have a renal failure due to dehydration. So we have an excessive urination. We lose that potassium, and we become severely dehydrated. And so in this again, this is going to be dose dependent. Severe cases are going to be between that 300 and 500 milligrams per kilo, and then lethal doses, again, is going to be greater than 500 milligrams per kilo. One of the things that we see with any metabolic acidosis, or really any patient presenting, and you could go back to the QSOFA, the new sepsis guidelines for pre-hospital medicine, that QSOFA guideline. You have a patient with a respiratory rate of 22 or greater, you have a systolic blood pressure of less than 100. That is a key thing. You have an altered mentation. We kind of use that high index of suspicion. You couple that with an end-tidal CO2 less than 25, and that's showing hemodynamic compromise. That's a patient that's should be put into a sepsis kind of alert. There's EMS programs out there now just based on those guidelines. They're drawing lactates, and they're giving prophylactic antibiotics. They're giving a gram-negative, gram-positive, just based on those assumptions. And so really, when you look at this presentation, aspirin overdoses are going to lead to that mental status change. They're going to increase respiratory rate, tachyarrhythmias or tachycardias. But one of the things that are going to focus you in on maybe an aspirin overdose is this hyperthermic response, and you're going to have a pretty significant hyperthermic response with an aspirin overdose. And so really, an aspirin overdose, where you see a hyperthermic response, those patients are going to be those patients that probably die. That's a very high mortality rate. Those are those lethal doses. So seeing a hyperthermic response based on an aspirin overdose is a pretty ominous finding. All right, let's next go to R. That's going to be renal failure. And so renal failure, we know, is based on, you have that initial acute, and then these patients eventually progress to that chronic renal failure, and you start having a buildup of uremia. And in this context, what happens is the kidneys have an inability to produce ammonia. That affects the ability to, excrete hydrogen ions. And in conjunction, you have an increased amount of bicarb loss. So the kidneys are getting rid of the bicarb. They can't get rid of the hydrogen ions, which is going to lead to acidosis, and they can't produce ammonia. And so based on that, we have this high excretion of bicarb. We have the holding on to hydrogen, and we become acidotic. So that is the key to chronic renal failure or severe acidosis based on the kidneys. K is going to be ketoacidosis. Ketoacidosis encompasses starvation, alcohol, and DKA. So starvation and ketoacidosis is very, very similar. And when we see this, the big issue is you have low insulin levels, and those low insulin levels prevent ketones from being utilized. And so you start having ketone elevation. If we're malnourished, you see this in both starvation and alcohol ketoacidosis. You're malnourished. You're also going to be dehydrated. And that dehydration impairs the excretion of ketones. And so you have that ketone production. That ketone production leads to acidosis. So this is seen, in alcohol patients that have been binge drinking, that have no fluid intake, no food intake. We know alcohol leads to, the loss of water, so you're going to be peeing all that out. And you also have often vomiting associated with this. So we have to have the ability to get rid of those ketones, and when we can't, that's where we have a big problem. And then obviously DKA, if you go to metabolic acidosis or Acidosis Rodeo Part 2, we went through DKA extensively. We looked at DKA. We talked about DKA compared to HHNK. So go ahead and check that out. I'm not going to get into that in this podcast. I think that's redundant. So that is G.O.L.D.M.A.R.K. That is kind of down and dirty, looking at these different causes. I highly recommend kind of maybe reading on this further if you want. And, I just wanted to kind of illustrate this last little section of the Acidosis Rodeo series. If you have any questions, you have any comments, you have any ideas for other cases or other podcasts, please email those to me. Again, my email is eric.bauer@FlightBridgeED.com. Love to hear your stories. Love to hear your success on your exams. So please keep in touch. Check out the website. Remember, we've got Fast 18 coming. We're going to have ticket sales actually ending December 1st. So if you're going to come, highly recommend you get on there and register. We do have a room block, discounted room rates, and so check that out. You can go to the link on the website and register there and reserve your room. But again, ticket sales are going to end on December 1st. I want to make sure we have enough seats, and we're limiting those tickets. So please check that out. We would love to meet you. The speaker lineup is epic. I would put this speaker lineup against any conference out there right now. This is phenomenal. So check it out. Got that schedule on the website. Got all the speakers, and would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, comments, please email me again. And until then, we'll talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.